Welcome to Module 7 in 279W, Clackamas Community College. In this particular module, we're going to talk about security, and we're also going to talk about server monitoring. So let's take a look at some of the features that are built into Windows Server 2016 when it comes to security. So we know that we have the Windows Firewall, which is built into every version of Windows, as well as Defender and some other options. Server Core and Nano Server, as we talked about in a previous module, are good solutions when it comes to server security because they don't come with a lot of things pre-installed. You'll have to manually install anything. It also has very little in the way of graphical user interface tools, so you're going to be doing command line for a lot of these. So that is one way you can increase security simply by using either Server Core or Nano Server. We can also use what's called a demilitarized zone. Now, this isn't necessarily something that you have to do in Windows. You can do this with a separate firewall, but you could do it in Windows if you had enough network connections and you had the firewall set up properly. So this is a portion of a network that's between two networks. So you have a private network, you have a public network, and the DMZ is between the two networks. And so basically you can put things like front-end servers. Let's say, for example, you have an email server on the inside using Microsoft Exchange. Rather than putting Exchange on the inside of your network, you could put the front end or the web access and the client access end in the DMZ, and then you can put the data in the private network, creating an additional layer of security between the inside and the outside world. Group policy is another way we can add security. As we saw in some previous modules, you can go in and change various different things in group policy to block out things that users can no longer see or use. You can also change security things such as adding a longer password or add additional complexity. In Windows Firewall, you also have IPsec, and they have merged those things in Windows Server 2016 for consistency, as it says here. And that basically means IPsec is a VPN tunneling technology, and Windows Firewall is a way you can block or open ports to the outside world or even to the LAN part of your network. However, IPsec was separate from that, and now they've merged those together so you can more easily open up ports and make VPN tunnels work better. Windows Defender has also gotten an upgrade in Windows Server 2016. It scans for viruses, spyware, and malware. The original Windows Defender was just a spyware scanner, and over time it started adding other anti-malware types of features. So it's better than ever in 2016. However, there's still a lot of malware that can get through, so most experts are suggesting you go with a third-party paid product, and there's many good ones out there. There's also security templates and security configuration and analysis tools, and they help you to enable all different types of security. So the templates are basically, in case you don't really know how to set up your network securely, you can download a template from Microsoft that will do it all for you, and then you can customize that template if you like. Another feature, user account control. This is something that's also in Windows 10 and Windows 8, and it allows, or it keeps the user from running when they're not administrators. It keeps them from running things that only administrators should be able to run without getting permission first. So it more fully insulates the kernel and keeps the operating system and desktop files stable. So basically it keeps viruses from getting in by making you have administrator credentials, or at least acknowledge any type of executable that tries to run on your computer or your server. And that will give you an additional pause to say whether or not it is something you want to do. So if something is trying to run on its own, that's also a way user account control can keep you safe. It will prompt you and say, hey, something's trying to launch. And at that point, you can kill it off if you need to. BitLocker is a great way to protect your data using encryption. BitLocker is a complete drive encryption product, whereas there's another thing called EFS. EFS basically will just encrypt files and folders. So you can just choose what you want encrypted rather than encrypting the entire hard drive. So EFS will definitely run faster, but security-wise, you probably would want to go with BitLocker, which is a feature you can install through your server manager. Now let's talk a little bit about server monitoring. You want to monitor your server for many different reasons. The first one would be to establish a baseline. So when you first install your server, you want to have a baseline of how it runs. So that way 6 months from now or a year from now, or when you go to make a major change to your server, you can go back in, run the performance monitor baseline again, and then see how much has changed. Are you really seeing a degradation of performance, or is everything pretty much as it was before? And if you see performance go down, you can then add additional resources such as more RAM, processing power, or faster hard drives at that point. So you really want to stop bottlenecks. And either one of those three become a bottleneck, then you need to resolve that in order for users to not have sluggish response. Sample benchmarks you might have established. You can do disk, CPU, memory, network response. So the network card is also something you want to do. Other server hardware applications. There's lots of different things that you can do using Performance Monitor to measure how things are working on your server. Resource Monitor is a real-time monitoring tool that's different than Performance Monitor. Performance Monitor is more comprehensive. It's going to give you hundreds, sometimes thousands, depending on what type of third-party products you have installed, of different things to monitor. You can monitor those in real time, but you would monitor specific hardware or software events. However, Resource Monitor is a little different. So what it does is it's more like Task Manager, but with a lot better detail. So you go into Resource Monitor and you see these top 4 areas: CPU, memory, disk, and network. And it shows you live not only what is being used in total, but also individually, each individual application or connection. And you can see how much memory it's using, how much disk it's using, etc. So it's very useful for a quick analysis. Like I said, you start with Task Manager, and from there you can actually launch Resource Monitor. There's an option for it in the performance area. So here is our Resource Monitor, and you can see here these various different categories, categories such as CPU, network, disk, etc. So the disk portion is definitely something you wouldn't even get in Task Manager. It doesn't really monitor disk to this level. And disks, more times than not, is going to be your bottleneck. CPU processors are so capable now that they rarely get into problems as being a bottleneck. RAM is very cheap, so you end up loading it up with RAM and never really running out if you plan it correctly. However, hard drives, completely different story. So people are still using the same speed hard drives we've been using for the last 20 years. 20 years ago, we had 15,000 RPM drives, 10,000 RPM drives, 7,200 RPM drives. Now we can switch to SSD. It does cost a lot more, but it will also give you up to 4 times the speed of what you have now. So that is typically the bottleneck nowadays, because of the fact people are still using the same speed hard drives that they have used traditionally. And it may be time to upgrade. Processors can be a bottleneck. It doesn't happen all that often. If it doesn't have enough processing speed to run an application, typically this would happen if you have an older computer when you're trying to run newer software. Memory bottlenecks can be caused by insufficient memory, but more likely it's going to be inefficient programs that have a memory leak. So basically what happens there is you launch a program, it uses a certain amount of RAM. When it's done doing whatever it's supposed to be doing, it's supposed to release that RAM back to the server, and because of poor programming or just a program that's not functioning properly, it doesn't release that RAM back in, and you have what's called a memory leak. And in that case, adding more RAM doesn't really help. You have to fix the problem. Hard disk bottlenecks we talked about. Network performance is also a possible bottleneck, but network speeds on servers are now typically at 10 gigabits, and 10 gigabit switches are not all that expensive like they used to be. So the possibility of getting a network bottleneck, even if you had a virus, is pretty low at 10 gigabits. However, at 1 gigabit, it's definitely more likely that you could see a bottleneck issue, especially if you have malware on your server, but also that's a good indicator that you even have malware. So a 10 gigabit connection might actually mask the fact you have malware because it couldn't possibly use all that bandwidth. Servers are always running lots of different services, and you can check what those services are in Resource Manager, but you can also check them out in Task Manager as well. And on page 475 of your book, you'll see some additional information. So you can access server services through actually multiple different options. So you can go to Server Manager, go to Tools, and choose Services. You can also get there from Computer Management. There's a Services section, and Task Manager shows services as well. Under Task Manager, however, you don't see the same name. You see more the name of the file rather than the friendly name that you see under the Services tool, like you see here. So these services can be stopped, they can be started, they can be restarted. Sometimes they get hung up, and when that happens, you need to go to the Task Manager to end the executable that's tied to the service. Otherwise, you'll have to restart your server. So when you experience problems on a server with a service, you can check the status, as I said, to see if it's in the middle of stopping or starting. So you can do several different things: start, stop, pause, resume, that kind of thing. You can also check dependencies. Sometimes one service is dependent on another service. You can't get that to start without the other service. You have to double click on there on the service just to see what its dependencies are. And there's actually a dependencies tab, as you see right here. So this service depends on the following system components. That means that those services have to be running in order for this service to work. And also, it has the option for the following system components depend on this service. So in order to make those other services work, this service has to be running. So those are both things that you need to count on. Not all services have dependencies, and they don't always have others depending on them, but many of them do. Task Manager, something that we've been using for quite a while in Windows Server and Windows Desktop. You can get there doing Control-Alt-Delete, going to the Task Manager, right-click on the taskbar, go to Task Manager. Lots of different ways to get there, and it is a quick way to check to see what's going on. So all the software applications, background processes, everything that's running on the server can be found in Task Manager. Now, there is a way to do this through command line as well, but most people find it easier to do this through the Task Manager. And when you launch Task Manager, it runs with the highest possible priority. So even if your server is seemingly locked up, many times doing Control-Alt-Delete and launching the Task Manager will actually still work because it runs at such a high priority. And from there, you can do things such as you can end tasks. You can go to details, file locations. You can actually even run commands as well. So if your Explorer, your Windows Explorer isn't working, that means your Start button is probably missing, and you can't run any tasks from there. However, from Task Manager, you can run any kind of task you want just by going to the Run command from the Task Manager menu. There is a Details tab that lists the processors in use by all running applications. One of the ways you can tell what's happening with the how these details and services and programs are all tied together is with this PID, the process ID. So the PID number is going to match up to the services process ID and to the program's process ID. So if you can't get one of these to stop, you can match up to the process ID in another tab in order to make that stop. Let's say, for instance, you're in the Services tab, and one of the services is in the starting process, so it never actually starts, or in the stopping process. So you go to that service in the Services tab, you look at the process ID, and then you go over to the Details tab and find the same PID or process ID number. You end the task on the Details tab or the Process tab, either one, and it'll also stop it from the services. So if you have a service that's stuck, that's a great way to end that service and then start it again manually if something gets stuck without having to restart the server. Details tab within Task Manager, you can increase priority of a process, so the list in the list so that it has more CPU priority. So you can actually add more processing power to a particular task. And this is where you do that. You right-click on one of them, go to Set Priority. You can choose Real Time, High, Above Normal. You can also set the affinity where you add additional processors. So there's a couple different ways you can add to a task's priority. Services tab in Task Manager shows the same services that you go to, as I mentioned earlier, if you go to Tools, Services in Server Manager, but it shows it in a way that's not quite as friendly. So as you can see here, the names that you see here, like W Search, well, if you saw that in the Services program, it would be called Windows Search, but they mean the same thing. Sometimes you have to double click on the services particular service to see what the unfriendly name is of W Search if you want to match those up. So the Performance tab is the one that most people go to when they first open Task Manager because it gives you a quick view of what's happening on your server. And it gives you lots of information such as handles, threads, and committed memory. And this tells you whether or not you're running out of particular resources. You also have something called paged pool and non-paged pool. And this is a really important part that you'll see under the Performance tab in the memory area. So the paged pool represents data that's in the paging file that is used in the paging file itself. So the paging file on a Windows computer is basically an extension of RAM. So when you run out of RAM, it uses a portion of the hard drive for less speed-intensive tasks to run as its chalkboard to do its calculations. So there's a paged pool amount of data that it uses as virtual memory for this. So if it's running out of this paged pool, then you know you've got a problem. Non-paged pool can be even more important because it's memory that can't be paged. It can't be put into the page file. So this non-paged pool could be a little processor that's sitting on the motherboard or a part of a processor that's on the motherboard. Just depends on the type of server that you have. And if that runs out, then you really run into problems because the paged pool memory can be increased. However, the non-paged pool memory cannot. So if you run out of that, you probably are going to have to restart your server and fix whatever application is causing that. And typically, it's a memory leak we talked about earlier. So this is what the Task Manager Performance tab looks like, and you can just click on either CPU, memory, or Ethernet. You also have the option at the bottom to open the Resource Monitor, which is the program we talked about prior to this, which gives you real-time data of all of the individual programs in a much easier to look at way. So here's what the memory looks like. And now we'll talk about network performance. So network performance, it shows send and receive packets on the network. One of the things it doesn't really give us is if there's any problems with connectivity. It will show us inbound packets and outbound packets, but unlike other tools, third-party tools, or unlike things like, say, on a Cisco router or firewall, it doesn't tell us if there's any CRC errors, cyclical redundancy check errors, or any other kinds of problems with the traffic. So unfortunately, you may still have to have a third-party program to get all the detail you need because inbound packets and outbound packets don't really give us the information that we need to have. So here's what the Ethernet one looks like. If you have two Ethernet cards, you'll see two Ethernets on there. Unlike CPUs, which shows just one category of CPU no matter how many that you have. And you can look at the inbound and outbound packets there. Users tab provides a list of users currently signed in. I actually use this a lot of times to see if a computer's been hacked. So if a customer will say, hey, my computer's been hacked, I think somebody's logged into the computer. If you go to the Users tab in Task Manager, you can see who's logged into it. And I've actually caught people who are illegally logged in using this information. And from there, what I can do is I can right-click and I can disconnect them and then, or log them off if I want to, and then I can disable that account so they can't get back in. You could also simply just unplug the network cable as well. And here we see the Users tab, and so we can see the administrator is the only one logged in, and you can see all the programs that the administrator is currently using. Talked a little bit about Performance Monitor, but we'll get a little more into it. It can be used to monitor components, hard disk, memory, processor, network interface, but also things like programs. And if you install some third-party programs, they'll come with their own performance monitors as well. that you can add in. So it can be opened from Server Manager. It can be opened from an MMC snap-in, lots of different ways to open Performance Monitor. It does tend to use a lot of processing power, so if your server's not running that great to begin with, Performance Monitor may not be the best tool to figure out what's going on. But if you're doing a baseline, it's a fantastic way of seeing how well your computer is doing. All right, sometimes instances are associated with a counter. We actually do add, when we add and remove snap-ins, we add in our Performance Monitor, then we add in counters after that. And there can be, like I said, more than 1,000 counters that are in your Performance Monitor, depending on what you have installed, what roles and features you have installed, as well as what third-party programs you have installed as well. There's 3 different view modes when monitoring objects. You've got the line, which is just a graph line, histogram bar, which shows a bar chart, not usually as popular, it's a little bit more difficult to follow, and then the report. So the report one is really useful if you're going to be checking Performance Monitor over a long period of time. So it uses a little less processing power than the line or histogram bar. So it's really good to be, if you want to run it for an hour without taking as big a hit of slowness to the server as the line or histogram bar would do. And the report can tell you over a longer period of time what is going on. Is the processor being overloaded and is the RAM being overloaded, etc. So once that's all done, then you can take action based on that information. So that will pretty much do it for Module 7. We talked about lots of good stuff, monitoring and security in Windows Server 2016. If you need any help, you know where to find me, and we'll see you again in Module 8.